Welcome back to our latest explainer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to literally trace the extraordinary, on-the-ground reality of Jesus' life using a brilliant 2D animated map derived straight from our source material. So often, this historical account is told purely through a philosophical or theological lens. But today, we're grounding it all in pure geography. We'll be plotting the exact distances, the ancient trade routes, and the topographical extremes to see exactly how this incredible story moved across the ancient world, tracing the map right from a humble birth in Bethlehem straight through to a totally dynamic ministry.
So, here is our itinerary for today's journey. First, Bethlehem, a humble beginning. Then, Nazareth, the hidden years. Followed by Galilee, ministry and miracles. Then we'll head down to Jerusalem for the final confrontation, move to Golgotha for the ultimate sacrifice, and finally look beyond the empty tomb. All right, let's get started with stop number 1, Bethlehem, and a very humble beginning.
What's absolutely fascinating here is the stark contrast between two completely different realities occupying almost the exact same geographical space. Over in Jerusalem, you've got King Herod the Great presiding over Israel, and his regime was frankly brutal. He was incredibly wealthy, but he enforced a crippling 40% tax rate on everything people earned. He used constant public crucifixions to terrify people out of rebelling, and he was so paranoid he even executed his own family members. But then, literally just 6 miles south, the text notes an arrival of absolute striking humility. In the tiny village of Bethlehem, inside a dark, freezing cave used to shelter animals, Jesus was born. And the very first witnesses, they weren't royalty or elites. They were marginalized shepherds, a group of people considered so unclean by society that their testimony wasn't even legally valid in Roman courts.
Now think about the number 90. That is the sheer physical toll in miles required just to reach that cave. 90 miles walked by a heavily pregnant Mary traveling from Nazareth all the way down to Bethlehem. That's a brutal journey taking roughly 4 days on foot. And according to the source, she didn't make this dangerous trek because she wanted to, but because she was forced to comply with a mandatory census ordered by the Roman emperor himself, Caesar Augustus.
And the journey doesn't stop there. Tracing our map southward from Bethlehem, we followed the family's sudden, desperate flight into exile. When King Herod ordered the massacre of infants in Bethlehem to wipe out any potential rival king, Mary and Joseph fled 400 miles south to Egypt. Now, the source highlights a really fascinating detail here. This massive, expensive journey was actually funded by those famous gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh brought by the Magi. Tradition places the family in Alexandria until Herod finally died. But when they returned, they couldn't just go back to Judea, because Herod's equally vicious son Archelaus had taken power, so they had to travel over 370 miles all the way back north.
Which perfectly sets up part 2 of our journey, Nazareth and the hidden years.
A lot of people just assume Jesus grew up in total isolation because Nazareth was so small it doesn't even appear in the Old Testament. But look at the geography. Right next door was the Via Maris. This was a massive, ancient international highway connecting Egypt to Damascus, and it sat just 6 kilometers from the village of Nazareth. So, from the hills of his hometown, a young Jesus wouldn't have been cut off from civilization at all. He literally grew up right on the edge of a bustling route, watching the vast, diverse Roman world march right past his backyard. For our next stop, we're plunging our map down to the lowest land point on Earth, below sea level. This is the Jordan River, and it's the exact geographical location where the source notes Jesus officially inaugurated his public ministry, traveling here to be baptized by his cousin, John. It's such a striking physical starting point, right?
beginning a ministry that was specifically designed to reach the lowest, most marginalized members of society at literally the lowest geographical elevation on the entire planet.
Let's move to Section 3, Galilee, where the ministry and the miracles really catch fire. Following our 2D animated map, it's basically a whirlwind tour across this northern region. First, at a wedding in a little town called Cana, he performs his very first public miracle, quietly turning 6 massive 26-gallon jars of water into the finest wine. From there, he sets up his base of operations in Capernaum, which was a strategic and notoriously corrupt border town right on that Via Mars highway. Our map then zigzags across the Sea of Galilee, where the accounts say he calmed massive storms with just 3 words. And finally, he journeys way up north to Caesarea Philippi. This was a region famous for its towering pagan temples, and it's right there that his disciple Peter officially confesses him to be the divine Messiah.
And the teachings he delivered in this region? Absolutely revolutionary. During his famous Sermon on the Mount, delivered on a hillside in Galilee to a rough crowd of fishermen and farmers, he essentially flipped the era's socio-political system totally upside down. The source emphasizes that he defied everything the Roman world rewarded. They rewarded strength, money, and power. But Jesus declared that the poor, the mourning, the meek, and the persecuted were actually the true heirs to his kingdom.
The pace on our map slows down, but the tension skyrockets as we enter Section 4, Jerusalem, for the final confrontation.
Before Abraham was, I am. By speaking those specific words, the source explains how Jesus claimed the sacred name of God, the very name revealed to Moses in the ancient scriptures. And he did this right in the religious epicenter of Jerusalem. Now, to the religious leaders of the time, this was no simple theological debate. This was intolerable, punishable by death blasphemy. They literally picked up stones to execute him right there on the Temple Mount, but he managed to slip away into the crowds. The battle lines were officially drawn.
As our map tracks the rapidly unfolding betrayal, we have to take a really dark geographical detour to a place called Gehenna. Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus to the religious authorities for 30 pieces of silver. But when the unbearable guilt finally sets in, Judas throws that silver back into the temple and flees out to Gehenna. The source details that this physical valley, the Valley of Hinnom, was an accursed place with a dark history of ancient pagan sacrifice. It literally gave the concept of hell its name. And tragically, this is exactly where the betrayer chose to end his own life. Moving through the absolute darkness of Thursday night into Friday morning, we track the chaotic, totally rule-breaking overnight trials. Our map frantically zigzags across Jerusalem. At midnight, Jesus is taken to Annas, a former high priest. Then, pre-dawn, he's moved to Caiaphas, the current high priest, which completely broke Jewish laws forbidding nighttime trials. By morning, since the Jewish authorities couldn't legally order an execution under Roman occupation, they march him across town to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Pilate, desperately looking for a legal loophole, briefly sends him over to Herod Antipas before Jesus is ultimately sent right back to Pilate to face the angry crowds.
Which brings us to the most somber location on our map, Section 5, Golgotha, and the ultimate sacrifice. 600 meters. That number just hits incredibly hard. It represents the brutal physical reality of the Via Dolorosa. The text notes that after Pilate caved to the crowds, Jesus endured a Roman scourging. This was a horrific whipping with bone and metal specifically designed to flay the skin. Severely weakened and bleeding, he was then forced to carry a massive, heavy crossbeam through the winding, narrow streets of Jerusalem's old city for 600 agonizing meters until he collapsed, finally arriving at the rocky execution site outside the city walls, Golgotha. Grounding this historical event in pure medical data makes it even more terrifying. The source points out that Roman crucifixion was fundamentally an agonizing execution by asphyxiation. It was an engineering marvel of cruelty, specifically designed for maximum public terror. Just to draw a single breath, the victim had to push their entire body upward, using the crude nails in their feet as a lever, scraping their scourged back against the rough wood, over and over again, sometimes for hours.
It is finished. The source captures his final breath at 3 in the afternoon as a strange darkness reportedly fell over the land. And it's crucial to note how the accounts describe this, not as a tragic defeat, but as a willing, purposeful completion of his mission. The source highlights that at the exact moment he spoke these words, an earth-shattering quake split the massive, thick curtain in the Jerusalem temple right in two, physically symbolizing that the barrier between humanity and the divine had been permanently torn open.
Now let's look at our final section, Section 6, Beyond the Empty Tomb.
Because our map doesn't end at the cross, it pans out and zigzags all over the region once again to track the reported post-resurrection appearances over the next 40 days. It starts on a Sunday morning at an empty tomb in Jerusalem, where, amazingly, marginalized women are uniquely chosen to be the very first witnesses. Then, the map tracks a 7-mile walk to a village called Emmaus, where he appears to 2 totally despondent followers. From there, the map leaps way back up north to the familiar shores of the Sea of Galilee, where he shares a miraculous breakfast of fish with his stunned disciples. And finally, it routes back down to the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem for his reported ascension.
In this number right here, 500, this is absolutely crucial. We're talking about the source's claim of 500 eyewitnesses. This wasn't just a handful of grieving disciples hallucinating in a locked room. According to the text, Jesus appeared to 500 people all at once on a mountain near Galilee. The source presents this staggering figure, hundreds of eyewitnesses who are later willing to face horrific deaths for what they claim they saw, as the primary catalyst for how this faith experienced such explosive, empire-wide growth in the decades that followed.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a massive, provocative question to ponder. How did a physical journey that literally originated in a dark, freezing animal cave in Bethlehem and ended on a brutal Roman cross manage to completely rewrite the map of human civilization? The geographical footprints of this one single life trace a path that ultimately reached the farthest corners of the globe. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey across the